Do you remember Tom Heaton at Richmond?
I'm sorry, do I remember Tom Heaton?
Right, Heaton.
I don't believe that name. I can't
Okay.
put, yeah. Was he a student or a faculty?
Yeah, student. He got the combination music and theology degree.
Okay.
One of my sons in the ministry, so to speak. He was in
really?
my youth, a youth group
great.
way
Yeah.
back in this. He was in my youth group way back in the 70s in Troy, Alabama.
Is that right? That's great. So you were a pastor in Alabama?
Well, I was a monster of music and education and youth and all that kind of thing.
Monster?
Yeah.
Never heard that before. I like it. Never.
I thought that was pretty common.
Never heard it before.
Well, are we going to get started here?
We were kind of waiting for Bob Johnson. He's supposed to be here introducing Chuck, but if not, I guess we are.
Okay.
Chuck Bugg, I guess you're known to everybody. You were at the seminary as a student and as a faculty member for 4.5 years. So without further ado, Chuck Bugg.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Melinda. I think we upgraded today with Melinda since Andy's at the dentist, and I appreciate so much Melinda's helping us with this. What I want to talk about, and really I want to leave plenty of time for your input, your discussion, your observations, your rebuttals, whatever you have to say, because what I'm going to be talking about today is something that I'm sure that I don't have the answer to the situation. I'm going to propose some responses, but I'm not going to tell you that I have the answer to what is the state of preaching in our churches today. I mean, that's kind of a broad swipe. And obviously it depends on the person who is preaching at your church. We have some very effective people who are preaching. And I certainly don't want to insinuate by asking about what is the state of preaching in the church, in churches in our nation today, and insinuate by that somehow we don't have very capable and very compassionate and very competent ministers. But what I want to talk about today is a challenge that we have. I started to say a problem, but usually challenge is a better word. The challenge that we are facing in terms of the church, and then I want us to look a little bit more at how maybe preaching plays into this. But first, I want to talk about where are we as churches in the United States? Most of us are familiar with the statistics that particularly since 2000, there has been a precipitous drop in terms of the attendance at churches and the involvement of people in churches. The church is getting older. Many churches, I'm not going to say every church, many churches are getting older. They're getting grayer. They're getting fewer, and they're getting poorer. So when we look at the situation of the church, what I want to do is to make some observations about maybe what are the things that we need to pay attention to that may be causing this, what I think is not only a precipitous drop, but also a dangerous drop for those of us who have invested our lives in the church. When we look at the reasons for what is happening, we can approach it in several different ways. And what I'm talking about now has nothing to do with preaching. It just has to do with the fact that particularly since 2000, we have so many people identifying themselves. I think the last statistics I saw was 25% identifying themselves as nuns. In the Christian Century, several months ago, they used the word unaffiliated, and they said 24%, which I guess is good news to use the word unaffiliated, and we drop a percentage. But regardless of what word we use, I think you and I are living in a time when we are going to have to face what is going on and ask ourselves, first of all, what is causing the problem? Diana Butler Bass, who is both a theologian as well as a sociologist, looks at what is happening in the churches in the United States as part of a cultural shift that really began in Western Europe a number of years ago. The declining number of people who are going to church. She said, if you look at Europe in terms of the number of people who are attending and participating in the church, she calls it a Great Depression. She then moves, staying with the Commonwealth, she moves to Canada. And she says, what we have in Canada is not so much a Great Depression as we have a depression. Then looking at the United States, her term for describing what we're facing right now is the term recession. Now, those are the words of Diana Butler Bass, looking at the church, especially in terms of sociology and some of the things that are happening in the church. There are places where the church seems to be thriving, places like Latin America, or even in many countries in Africa. But in terms of Western Europe, in terms of our own North American continent, and especially in terms of the United States, we are facing what Diana Butler Bass calls a recession. And this is not to say that every church is in recession, but it is to say that if you and I take the broad sweep of churches, the fact of the matter is that there are fewer people who are involved in attending, and many of the people who are involved are older people. So Diana Butler Bass offers the fact that maybe one of the issues that we're facing is more of a cultural issue, that people simply have a disinterest in the church. The other thing that I think we need, or several things we need to take into account that are contributing to the fact that we are living in a time when there is declining numbers of people in the church. And that is, you and I are living in a time when, for lack of a better term, there is a whole lot more competition with the church. For example, those of us who have been pastors, even in the 1980s, became familiar with the fact that sports, this is not to denigrate sports. I happen to like sports. But what was happening is that sports, and particularly these traveling teams, there were other things that people were seeing as important to their lives. And in many ways, they were conflicting with the times in which the church was meeting. When I was a pastor in Augusta, Georgia, I was on the board of directors of the local YMCA. We met once a month early in the morning. And I will never forget walking into one meeting. The director of our YMCA was a wonderful man, a very fine Christian man named Joe. As we came into the room, Joe said to me, he said, "Chuck, in 2 weeks, we're going to be hosting the state soccer tournament here in our fields." Now, the fields of the YMCA was very close to our church, and the fields were very obvious to the people who were coming to the church. I thought it was intriguing what he asked me. Our church happened to be on television at the time. He said, "Chuck, I would appreciate if you didn't say anything on television about what we're doing, the YMCA, and having this tournament on Sunday." Now, I was baffled for just a moment. I said, "Joe," I said, "this is already scheduled. I will make this commitment to you. I will not say anything on the television about this particular event. But I do want you to know, as much as I am grateful for what you have to offer at the YMCA, and grateful for what you're doing, and grateful to be a part of it, if this happens again, if there is something scheduled on Sunday where the people in our church are seeing all of this, I will say something on television." But it was an example of how there are so many things that are competing with the life of the church. And I just use sports as an example. The other thing that I would like to talk about is the fact that I think in the church, and this is of deep concern to me, with all of the changes in the ethos and in the world in which we're living, I see very little creativity and very little willingness to change the way that we do things in the church to meet the issues that we're facing. I was on the Constitution and Bylaws Committee in our church. There was a part of me that wanted to say when we were meeting, let's just scrap this whole thing. What we are doing is we are simply revising something that started well before 2000, and we just are tweaking things, but things basically are staying the same. Can we think about abandoning just everything that we're doing and starting at the beginning and asking ourselves the question, how is it that the church needs to be structured? How is it that we need to be organized? What are the things that are important today that may not be important today, but were important a long time ago, and we simply are perpetuating and just doing little revisions to things. For example, in most churches where I have experience, the committees, we have opted in some churches to go to the word team, although it looks like a committee to me. But basically, we are operating with many of the same, with much of the same structure that we've always had. We're operating with the finance committee and the personnel committee and all of these committees. And I keep wondering to myself, when is it that we're going to ask ourselves the question, the church is declining. Is this a time simply to be perpetuating what we've already had? Or is it a time for us to think creatively about how we can organize the church in a way that meets the needs of people? For example, in many churches that I see, and this may not be true of your church, the primary committees are what I call maintenance kinds of committees. We need a budget, the budget is done. We need personnel, the personnel committee continues to operate. Do we ask ourselves the question, with such a precipitous decline in the attendance and the involvement of people in the church, what are ways that we can think creatively about structuring the church in order to reach those needs? At the church I attend, we have an outreach committee, which I'm grateful for. But sometimes I wish that we had more teams or committees or groups of people that began to look at the entire church, the worship experience, the way preaching is done, the organizing of how we do outreach in our kind of world, so that we begin to think more creatively about some ways in which we can do the work of the church and not simply perpetuate the maintenance model of the church. I really believe that we are beyond the point when simply using the maintenance model of the church is going to be helpful to us as we face some of these issues of why people are not coming to our churches. What is going on? What is it that is happening or not happening? And to do that kind of painful examination of things, it is painful to change. It is painful to look deeply at some of the things that we do. I was thinking the other day back in the old days, when I was growing up in church, we had Sunday school at 9:45 and we had worship at 11. Now, we also had training union and some other things. We usually had an evening worship. But why is it that we continue to do church and Sunday school at 9:45 or 11 o'clock or somewhere in that range? Do we need to think about some creative ways in which to reach people? Some ways of really going back to examining the structures in terms of what are the priorities of the church. If the priority of the church is simply to maintain the status quo, I believe that we're doing a good job at that. But my own thinking is that with what is going on, we've got to think about ways more than maintaining the status quo, because I don't believe that is really working. How are we going to reach younger people? How are we going to bring them into the church? What is it that we're doing or not doing that is keeping many of them from being involved in the church? We simply can't go on getting grayer and older, because the people who are supporting many of our churches, they're not going to be here in 10 or 15 or 20 years. So can we think really creatively and imaginatively and courageously about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and maybe what we need to do differently in order to attract people into the church? The other thing I want to say is that in terms of what is happening in the life of the church, I want to step into the role of kind of a preacher for just a moment, but also stay connected to the church, not just as a preacher. I really believe that we've got to think about where we are in terms of preaching in 2022. I'm well aware of COVID-19 and how this has affected the church, and we can't ignore that, the effect of that. But I still want to think about what is going on, for example, in preaching, that we need to understand, and I would say also in worship, the whole worship event. Many of you are familiar with the name of Fred Craddock. Probably nobody had any greater influence on homiletics than Fred Craddock. Taught at Candler School of Theology. But before he went to Candler, in 1971, he was at a small Disciples of Christ seminary in Enid, Oklahoma. And Craddock wrote a monograph called As One Without Authority. Craddock said, there are a couple of things that are happening that we need to look at. This is 1971. One, he said, what we're finding in much preaching is that preachers go into the study and there is some excitement of the encounter with the text and some struggling with the text, but then we emerge at the worship service, and what we offer to people is simply deductive conclusions of what we've gained from what we've experienced in the study. Why not carry into the sanctuary some of the struggles that we have? I'm working with a group of ministers now, and we're doing lectionary preaching. Last week, we're moving toward Lent. Last week was on the temptation of Jesus. We look at that text and we ask ourselves, where do we hit a speed bump in that text? What is that text saying that we're not really hearing? And even sometimes we can make a paraphrase of the text and ask ourselves, what is it that we left out of the paraphrase? And that may very well be the thing that we focus on in our preaching. For example, last week in the temptation story of Jesus, if you are the Son of God, if you are the Son of God, finally jump from the pinnacle of the temple and the angels will catch you and you won't be hurt at all. That was the temptation, to which Jesus said, no, because the way I'm going to enter Jerusalem is not by jumping off the pinnacle of the temple. As much of a spectacle as that would be, I'm going to walk in to Jerusalem and I'm going to experience suffering and rejection and pain and crucifixion and all of the things that went with his experience of the journey to Jerusalem. But I have to look at that and say to myself, Jesus, what about every 10 years you pick a large building in some major city and you jump off of it and the angels catch you and you don't hurt yourself? I guarantee the next week, our churches will be packed with people. There is the allure of the spectacular. But Jesus said no to the allure of the spectacular by saying yes to the journey to Jerusalem and the suffering that meant for Jesus. So Craddock said, when we go to a text in his book as one without authority, he said, what we need to do is to see if we can bring into the pulpit some of the excitement, some of the encounter with the text, rather than just treating the text as a bottle into which we reach to pick out something to say on Sunday morning. We treat the text as something to be encountered in our own lives, and we bring that sense of encountering the text to the pulpit so that people see the breadth of Scripture. In 1978, Craddock wrote a book. He went to Germany to do a sabbatical. He got to Germany and he couldn't figure out what he was going to do in Germany that related to homiletics. He tells the story of sitting on a bench on the street, professor from a local college, about 2 sheets to the wind, inebriated. But he looked at Craddock, and Craddock said, I really don't know what to do. And the response of the professor is, why don't you study Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher and theologian? So the result of that was Craddock's book, Overhearing the Gospel. the fundamental thing that Craddock said in that book that I think you and I need to question right now is Craddock said, there is no lack of information in the Christian land. He took that from Kierkegaard, talking about his native Denmark. But Craddock then applied it to our nation, and he said, the problem with preaching is that folks are bored with our preaching. What we have to do is what Augustine did when Augustine talked about the three things that preaching needs to do. Augustine said it needs to teach, it needs to delight, not delight in the sense of telling a lot of humorous stories, but delight in the sense of if you've ever been with your spouse to a movie that you walked out of it and both of you were thinking about what was this movie really about? What was the meaning of the movie? And you spent your time driving home just thinking about that, the kind of delight that comes when something not only shares information with you, but also creates a sense of delight. And of course, the final thing that Augustine said was that a sermon persuades, teaches, delights, persuades. In Overhearing the Gospel, Craddock said, since there is no lack of information in the Christian land, what we need to stop doing is boring people with a lot of deductive preaching that is aimed toward teaching people. The kind of preaching that I grew up with, and maybe you grew up with, the first point, the second point, the third point. What Craddock said is, we don't have a lack of information in the Christian land. What we have is, we have boredom in our churches. People may still be coming to church, but they are bored with what is being said from the pulpit. Can we bring a sense of delight to the pulpit? Now, here's where I would take great issue with this. Tom Long, who is another great, outstanding homiletician, retired now from Candler. He followed Fred Craddock. Tom Long says that about once every 50 years, preaching goes through a nervous breakdown. By that he meant we've been doing it this way, and now we have to look at the context in which we're doing it and ask ourselves the question, what is it and how is it that we need to do it? The point is that you and I are not living in a land where there is a lack of information. One of the primary problems that we face today is the problem of biblical illiteracy in our congregations. So that has caused me, in terms of the times that I preach, never to say anything like this to the congregation. Even if I'm reading John 3:16, I'm not going to say, I know that all of you have heard this before. What I don't know is that they've heard this before. I'm not going to say to them, I'm going to talk with you in my sermon about what you already know, and I want to remind you of something. I'm going to assume that we are starting with people many people in our churches for whom there is a lack of information and I'm not sure I would even say we live in a Christian land. There was a wonderful book written a few years ago by William Harness. It used Augustine, as some people call him. It was called Augustine and the Catechumenate. The book was written after they had done a exploration of the old city of Hippo, where Augustine was the bishop. And they found the arena in which Augustine would preach at least once a day and sometimes twice a day. Augustine was known as a powerful orator. So in the congregation, there were baby Christians, mature Christians, Manichaeans, people of mystery religions, all kinds of people who were listening to Augustine. And Augustine had enough wisdom to know that at times he would say something like this: I want to talk to those of you who are new in the faith. I know some of you already know all of this, but I want you to overhear what I'm saying to these new people in the faith. I want to talk to those of you who are pagans, who have your spectacles in the street. And I want to tell you about the great spectacle that we have in the church, which is called the Eucharist. I want to talk to those of you who are mature in the faith. Those of you who are new in the faith may not understand some of this, but I want to talk with you because as you grow, you're going to encounter some of this. That's called overhearing the gospel. You and I are not preaching to a monolithic group of people, all with the same needs and all at the same place. And one of the things that I believe about preaching is that we have to be in tune with where the congregation is and be able to say, for just a moment, I want to talk to those of you who are older and facing problems in your health. I want to talk to you just a minute, and I want the rest of you just to overhear. Now, when you and I invite people to overhear, I guarantee they're going to be listening better than if we said something directly to them. They're going to say, I want to hear this. If he's not talking to me or she's not talking to me, I want to hear what is being said. So I think that's an issue. Do we really know where our congregation is? And do we make assumptions about what their knowledge is? Some years ago, I went to do a week study at the College of Preachers, the old College of Preachers at the National Cathedral in Washington. One of the things we did was we preached in small groups. When I had finished my sermon, there was a very bright young woman who is a pastor in Vermont. She thanked me for the sermon, but then she said, I had made some analogy to Abraham and Isaac without explaining it. She said, if you had made that analogy in my church, most of the people would not have understood it. I began to think as I went back to Augusta, to the buckle of the Bible Belt, I'm thinking, what am I assuming that I need not to assume? So I think that's one of the issues that we face. Let me move just quickly to a couple of things, and then I want to get your feedback. One of the things that I believe we're missing, or at least I missed when I taught preaching, was giving people a theology of preaching. A lot of preaching courses are built around, I want to tell you 6 things that you should do. And if you do these 6 things, then your sermons are going to be good. Fred Craddock, in his book on preaching, talks about theology for preaching, which is the theology that you and I bring to the pulpit to share with people. But he also talks about a theology of preaching. Unfortunately, he doesn't explain that. Karl Barth is a long ago figure in the history of the church. But when I want to get a theology of preaching, I go to somebody like Karl Barth, who said the word of God is made real to us in 3 different ways. Through the Logos, through the word that is made flesh, through the prophets and the apostles, through the biblical revelation. And then Barth said, the word of God comes to us in preaching. Preaching, Barth said, is a sacrament. It's not to be taken lightly. I understand that those who are pastors live, as I often did, from hand to mouth. We are not sent just to prepare a sermon on Sunday. But with that said, the place where we encounter most of the people, and the place where people make judgments about our competency, our care, our understanding of their needs, is not just the words that we speak in the pulpit, but it is the impression that is given through those words and between those words, and then they make decisions about, is this the kind of pastor that I can bring the difficulties, the struggles of my life? Is this the kind of pastor who understands? Let me just talk about 1 or 2 other things, and then I want to get your response. I'm asking myself the question, why are the nuns, which largely involve younger people, not coming to the church? We know a couple of things about many of them. One is that many of them identify themselves as spiritual, not religious, but as spiritual. And I asked myself the question, when you and I preach, or when our pastors preach, do we have a sense that what people are looking for is not to be more religious, but what they're looking for is for some kind of deep relationship with the transcendent, with the beyond, with the otherness of God, the mystery of God, but also with the God who became flesh. The other thing we know about a lot of these younger people is they are very interested in social issues. Let's take, for example, climate change. We are already seeing the effects of climate change, and a lot of these younger people are asking themselves very legitimately, will the world in which I have my children and grandchildren be a world in which people can live? Or is there so much carbon emission? Are there so many nitrates dumped into the water that I'm going to live in a world that is just sitting on the edge of disaster? I was visiting with my niece over Thanksgiving. She said, I want to tell you a book written by a man by the name of Robert Stearns called The Hole in the Gospel. My niece has been a fairly conservative Christian, going to a conservative church. But she's a thoughtful person. This church met during the pandemic with no masking, and there were people in that church who died. The wife of the minister asked Jenny one day, why is it that people aren't coming to the church? And Jenny said, they're not coming to the church because you didn't take them seriously. But she also said, she looked at me and she said, read The Hole in the Gospel by Robert Stearns. Because what it does is it brings into our thinking the fact that faith is both a personal experience, but it is also an experience in which you and I are called into the world to be missional people. Here's the example that she told me. What would happen if in a single week there were 10,000 people that died from airplane crashes? Well, you and I know what would happen. Maybe at the end of the week, they would say, we've got to do a total examination of the way in which we're doing this. What if the second week, another 10,000 people died in airplane crashes? The airline industry would have to say, we've got to shut down until we find what is causing the problem. 10,000 people a week in the world in which you and I live die of malnutrition and starvation. And I said, Jenny, thank you so much for just making how clear it is that you and I are in that balance where we call people as individuals to be transformed in their relationship with Jesus Christ. And then we call people to be transforming agents of Jesus Christ in a world that desperately needs to be changed. In 2000, there was a book written by Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone. Kind of a strange title. Robert Putnam did a survey of over 500,000 people over a 25-year period up to the time of the publishing or the writing of his book. And what he noticed was that people were not socializing as much as they used to. People were not joining the Rotary Club or the Kiwanis Club. Things were dropping. And then he said, the reason he wrote Bowling Alone, he says that the number of people who are in bowling leagues has dropped. And a lot of people are simply bowling alone. The sad part of that, he said, is we never really come to know our neighbors. We never really come to know what it is to be socialized. We never really come to know what it is to be intimate and to share with other people if we're simply bowling alone. I don't know what the answer is. But I want to tell you, I see a lot of articles about the problem that we're facing and the problem of people not coming to church. But I see very little things being offered as antidotes to the problem. And I see virtually nothing about the role of worship and preaching. And I have to tell you, that really bothers me. Let's open it up to you for your response, rebuttals, other insights that you have. We'll try to close it out by 4:30. I think I heard that some people were saying we can be finished by 4:30. So we will try to be finished by 4:30. So are you all on where you can talk? Yep. Okay.
Well, you paint a very picture of the church. There are some who are decreasing, some are. I think one thing is, you mentioned competition, sports, but a lot of the mega churches, some of which my kids go to now, are the entertainment centers in their lives. I mean, I've attended there and it's like a rock show. And, that appeals to young people. Doesn't appeal to me. but that's drawing a lot of the young people. Now we have in our little church, Austin Heights in Nacogdoches, we've got young people and a lot of kids come up for the children's sermon. Of course, you know, Kyle Childress is not your typical preacher. We're known in the community as the Barely Baptist Church. And then we had Bob Johnson come last week and tear up the town down at the local Black church, where we combined with Iron Wheel Baptist Church for a MLK service. And the community really turned out in that. But it is a dilemma. It is a dilemma. I agree with you. I could go on, but somebody else needs to talk. Bob, you did a great job.
Thank you.
Judith, you're on mute, Judith. I see a mouth moving.
Unmute. Okay. Chuck, Bob Browning, what advice would you give to a young minister today?
Bob, again, part of it is my disposition toward preaching and worship. I would say you really need to work on making that as effective and connected to the lives of people as you can. I would say the learning of preaching does not stop at the seminary. Probably, and I don't mean this as an insult to the seminary, but when I left, I had to unlearn some things. For example, and I had a super nice professor of preaching. One of the things I think was missing is he taught us to do sermons as written documents. Rather than, if we write, we need to write as the Bible does, and that is with mouth to ear. There are some very effective young ministers, but I encounter some who simply don't take that preaching event as seriously as they should. And they get into bad habits. And the only thing I know to try to correct that is to try to go and learn and pick up whatever you can from people who can help you to be more effective. Does that get at your question, Bob? I know it doesn't answer the question, but
no, it does. It does. It does. Someone with your experience and expertise, I would hope that younger ministers would seek out people like you and so many others, and have an ongoing dialogue about preaching. I think that would be extremely helpful for them to get a preaching mentor and to really bounce some ideas off of them, but also approach them with an open heart and a listening ear.
Mm-hmm.
Chuck, I have a question for you. It comes from my some of my children's response to their preaching, and they talked about preachers not being educated enough about what's happening in the world and in culture, and relying too much on illustrations that do not relate to people. Illustrations from even from TV would be illustrations from 2, 3, 4 decades ago, and that preaching does not contain enough relevance with the culture of today. What's your response to
that? One of the things, to go back to what I said, is I really think that in our preaching, we need to take very seriously delight. I mean, I don't want to get people into preaching boring sermons. At the same time, I think we need to think about the content of what we're saying to people. I mean, is this something that those of us who have been to seminary, we have to do the same thing that a neurosurgeon does. Our son had a malignant brain tumor. And so we've had a lot of experience with neurosurgeons. Some of them talk to us in the medical jargon. Some of them obviously knew, or at least I hope they knew, but they talk to us in ways, and they talk to David in ways that were understandable. I'm not sure, and this may offend some people, I'm not sure that we're doing an adequate job in the training of ministers in several areas, not only in terms of the preaching event, in terms of putting together a sermon, or in terms of having teaching and delight and persuasion in it. But I think my experience was that the seminary curriculum and seminary curricula of which I've been a part are very fragmented. You go to the New Testament or the Old Testament class and you learn about JEP&D and the documentary hypothesis. Well, that's wonderful. But you go to preaching and there's never any way of how do I incorporate this in a way that I don't sound as if I've just stepped off the seminary train. But I have that knowledge so that it empowers the sermon. It makes it more lively. It's not a getting up and I want to tell you about the documentary hypothesis. You've lost it. Or maybe you've lost everybody except those who've been to seminary, and they may put their heads up and think, what in the world's going on? But I really see a diminishing emphasis in many of our divinity schools and seminaries on preaching. Oftentimes, it's one course, Introduction to Preaching. When I was coming through seminary, one of the things I appreciated when I taught with Larry at Southern was the preaching practicum, where the students actually preached and had feedback from people. And you, not only you as the professor, but also other people in the class, we're able to pick up things that become idiosyncratic to a lot of our preaching that we don't even notice. For example, one of the things that bothers me is the nervous movement of some preachers, the peripatetic minister who runs to this side and runs to that side and runs to this side and runs to that side without ever really having any rationale for it. I mean, I don't want to see the minister. If there is movement, I want it to have a purpose in that movement, not just because I've got this energy going and I've got to move from side to side. One of the things that I would like to say a word about is with regard to mega churches. The fact of the matter is that actually all churches are decreasing except for the Roman Catholic Church. And a lot of that is because of the immigration of people into our country who are Roman Catholic. The entertainment factor is a part of the mega church. I'm not for, okay, let's just write off the mega church, let's be as boring as we can be. I think there's a way in which you can preach, not just kind of a thin gruel gospel, but a gospel that calls us to transformation, and a gospel that is exciting, and a gospel where you come to the pulpit and you are feeling the excitement of being transformed. Why let the excitement be with the mega churches? Now, we may not have synthesizers and all of that in our church, but in terms of preaching, I'm not willing to cede the delight of preaching to mega church pastors. Neither am I willing to cede to them the fact that, as somebody has said, that what we're having is a lot of wisdom preaching in a lot of these churches. And by that, you know, questions like, how do you have a better marriage? How do you raise your children to be caring and loving? How do you get promotions in your job? How do you get ahead? Now, I suppose that has an attraction to it, but to me, it sounds as if we're jumping from the pinnacle of the temple and we're not making the journey of Lent. And I think the journey that we make to Lent is as profound and as life-changing and as transformative as anything that we do. And I'm not going to get up and let things like that slide out of the corners of my mouth as if I have to be apologetic. Does that, that's just kind of my read on thing. I know people are going to mega churches. I know there's a great entertainment value. I know that many of the preachers of these mega churches are actually very good at preaching. I mean, in terms of communicating a message. The question is it the full message of the gospel? And that's just my question. Yeah.
You mentioned Fred Craddock a while ago, and a master storyteller. He was an inspiration for me in my preaching. One thing that struck me was his vulnerability and his encouragement to vulnerability of us telling our own stories and how we relate to what's going on in the world. You mentioned that too, of not just experiences in the past, but what's going on today, and how do I, as a Christian, relate to, like the crisis in Dallas at the synagogue last weekend. I wonder how many sermons were preached that included that and Martin Luther King weekend, or do we shy away from that because we would be racist or whatever? We need to be contemporary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, going back to your observation about illustrations, I think you're exactly right. We need to watch illustrations that we use. For example, if I use an illustration from a movie, which I don't do, and I say, let's just take Field of Dreams, because it has a lot of fiber in there in which we can preach. But I start talking about Field of Dreams, and the people out in the congregation who haven't seen the movie immediately feel left out. So you're exactly right. I mean, what I want to do is to use illustrations with which people can identify. I think that's the genius of Fred Craddock. I think the genius of Fred Craddock, also in terms of storytelling, is something that often, I forget, and that is the pace of the sermon. The sermon is not just rattling off things. There are times when something lands softly and gently. I want to tell you about the time and people are listening, and he's not rushing that story. Yeah, I did a sabbatical with Fred Craddock, and I'm by no means am I a Fred Craddock, but I learned so much from him.
Muting.
Anybody?
Judah's pad is muted.
Okay, the whole thing is muted.
Okay, now?
There we go.
Yeah.
I was pastor in Madison, New Jersey for a while and drew seminaries there. And I had a couple of students who were there to work on advanced degrees in homiletics. They told me they were being modeled for 8-minute sermons. And I thought, most Baptist ministers can't clear their throats and get to name their points inside of that. Mm-hmm. And I don't think our congregations would be open to that and say that we've worshiped. They had to work hard, I think, to have any quality in 8 minutes, but that's a pretty tight lit thing. This, of course, was a Methodist school. And so they're used to John Wesley's tradition and biblical preaching. But of course, they're also influenced by the liturgical churches, which have a shorter time for preaching. But what I learned, I was even stunned even more. Before that pastorate, I had a pastorate only 40 minutes from Yale in Connecticut. And the young assistant at the congregational church in town was told, don't bother to take preaching, just take a counseling course. Preaching's not doing anything today. And I'm thinking, good grief, an Ivy League school with the prestige that they have and the history deeply rooted they have in the Congregationalism and Calvinism of New England, and that's the best they can do. And I remember a couple of us, a little bit more experienced guys, took this guy under wing and taught him a few, I don't want to say tricks of the trade, that sounds illegal, but we tried to guide him in a few basic things. So this is not something peculiar to us Baptists, but I also found that you need to know your congregation well enough to speak their language and to know what their pressure points are. And whenever I could hit right on that, I got fuller and better attention and more inquiries. But sometimes it's important to also say, well, I know many of you haven't heard sermons on the 10 Commandments recently. That's almost gone passe. But let's talk about what that means and just kind of go through that and study it and work with them on it and talk about what a basis it is. Also, I had 9 different ethnic groups in one of my churches, and I was always interested in learning to hear from the different ethnic backgrounds and to let people like that at least give testimonies, if not have a sermon time. So we have to keep working at it. And Chuck, you're really good at that. And I appreciate what you shared today, but there's a lot yet to be learned. And it's still absolutely important in the central telling of the gospel. And I've had a chance to go overseas like many of you guys had and preach. And I don't go and preach and tell jokes. I try to find out what the heart of the gospel is and who Jesus is and what he's all about. And so you look closely at what your context is. You try to learn your congregation, some of their do's and don'ts. One day I preached to my congregation in Connecticut, Jesus Christ meets Dale Carnegie. Now I did that on purpose because everybody in my church that worked for an industry had to have a Dale Carnegie course. What I didn't know was that Dale Carnegie's personal secretary of 6 years was one of the visitors in the congregation. I didn't make fun of Dale Carnegie. He was a wonderful Methodist layman, I believe. And he was very religious. And I talked about the pluses of that. But I said, you must talk about too, who is a man? What is he all for? Where is he headed? And that's what the gospel is dealing with, not developing just pleasantries and communications with others, but what is the message that drives you? And for whatever it's worth, I just pass that on. Many of you have many good ideas. One time I jumped in and did a monologue. I'm not very good at that at all. I know some people who are very good at it. And I did it on Easter Sunday. That was a poor choice. Half the congregation got mad. They thought I hadn't even preached on Easter, and they were really let down. But I had a lot of TV people up close to New York and a lot of actors and people who were very busy in Broadway, and they liked that. And I did it like it was a news announcement. And it was an adaptation of some things I'd read and some other things I'd put together. And again, I want to say, you try to act out the character, you set the setting, you show the conclusion, you leave the question marks and make people want to understand more. So I found out constantly that's important. Don't get fixated, I guess, with a style and with a certain amount of material that you feel like you have to get through. Sometimes we need to just back off and say, I need to get inside the shoes of these people a little more and work that way. Okay, that's it.
Yeah, good words, Wallace. Yeah, it's interesting about the length of the sermon. I think we always want to be finished before the congregation is. Otherwise, it's a painful experience. And I think these days in the digital age in which we live, where people are getting information that way, I've tried not to preach more than 25 minutes. Because I've abused that rule more times than I should, but I really think that's where people are in terms of what they can listen, which means we've got to get to it fairly quick. I mean, the idea of some kind of spectacular introduction to a sermon takes time. And then where do you go from there? You just told this spectacular story, and then you said, now let's look at Exodus. I mean, that is not just a bad cognitive transition, it's a bad emotive transition. So
I agree with you about the 20 minutes when it comes to white congregations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And he says, if I don't preach 45 minutes to an hour, my congregation is disappointed. So I'd go back to what Wallace said, and that is preaching is unique to the cultural expectations of the congregation. And so many of our seminaries have educated people in the white model. I think to know ourselves, to know our congregation, and to know the scripture, it is a lifelong experience, and really tough for us. What advice would you have for those who are preaching to congregations that might have several ethnic groups?
I think one of the things, as Wallace has pointed out, is you really have to find what their needs are. So you're going to have to do a variety of things. I mean, I don't think we're talking about one size fits all. I remember one class I taught at Baptist Seminary of Richmond. I had about 4 or 5 students in that class who were from the former Burma, now Myanmar. And here I have my syllabus done, with illustrations and stories and how to. So I said to them, if you invited me to come to Burma to preach, what would you tell me? And they said, you can throw out all the stories and just speak for 3 hours, Now, yeah, you're right. I mean, what I've done is talk from a very Caucasian perspective. Our friend Frank Houston, who is the African-American pastor of First Baptist Georgetown, I think I could preach a lot longer if I were getting drum rolls and responses from the congregation and things like that. I mean, in fact, I have preached in African-American churches where my wife has said, I'll never go again because your 25-minute sermon turns into a 45-minute sermon. And I said, but you don't understand, this feels so good. I just hate to stop, So she won't go when I'm preaching. She will go when Frank Houston's preaching. Yeah. Very good observation. Anything else? I appreciate so much I'm sorry.
I exchanged a pulpit with an African-American preacher in the Bronx, one of the 5 subsections of New York City. And this was a big thing in our 220 church association for friendship, for communication, for partnerships, and maybe missions we were sponsoring together. And I remember going down to Brother Fox's church down in the Bronx because I wanted to scout out how he operated, what he said, and what he did. Well, the basic worship service was 2 hours. There was a deacon who came out and led in a Bible study, which became a sermon. There were certain people that prayed and certain people that sang. And about the time they were getting warmed up, that was like the front group for the big pastor to come in and do his work. And all I can tell you is it wasn't boring. In fact, it was profoundly effective.
Yeah.
So I pulled Brother Fox aside. I said, now, I got to tell you something. You're going to my church. It's all white collar executives, and they want to get out of church about 2 minutes to 12. So please adapt what you're doing, not because we don't appreciate what you're doing, but these people are impertinent enough. They might just get up and walk out. And I said, so, and then he stopped and said, Brother Williams, do you know what the biggest difference is between Black congregations and white congregations? I said, well, I would really like to know. Tell me. He says, well, if you're in a white congregation and Black congregation, you're always wondering, what is God going to do next here? If you're in a white congregation, you're always asking, what time is it? That's a big cultural difference.
Yeah. That's great.
But so we sometimes get too conscious of that. But I think from our tradition, if we got too comfortable and too noisy about going over and too much, we would hear about it. And sometimes that's just a lack of discipline. So I understand, but it is significant.
Mm-hmm. Well, listen,
Chuck,
I'm sorry.
Chuck, it's Dennis.
Hey, Dennis.
I appreciate what all you were saying there today. I would just, this is my 47th year doing this, and 35 of those as a pastor and 12 of them as an associate. And one of the things that I think I've learned about me is that the people when I started in the 70s were primarily folks who at least a third of the congregation would be back on Wednesday night. Mm-hmm. Sometimes a half would be back, and at least a third to a half would be there on Sunday evening. And so I can remember planning a year's preaching work with the old Andrew Blackwood and other books like that back from the 70s, and realizing that I needed Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night planning. And so I would have all this time, and I had all those 5 church program organizations, with missions and church training and all that stuff that was going on with the people. And today we just don't have much of that, because the primary purpose of Sunday school hour, or the spiritual growth groups hour, is to reconnect the folks socially with a little bit of Bible study or theological conversation attached, and a lot of congregational care that happens in those good groups. And then I'm expected, as a pastoral preacher here at St. John's in Charlotte, I'm expected to fit all of the glory and goodness that I can come up with in about 15 minutes. And if I go beyond that, I'm free to do that. But if they had their digital devices, they'd be turning in to see what time Panthers kickoff is going. And so I'm listening to what all you're saying, and fully aware that reflecting on the idea that I think what I'm doing these days, not just because it's a pandemic time, but I think what I'm realizing is more and more the people who attend regularly on Sundays, most of them are either overly committed or burdened down with just life itself. They're serious-minded and hearted people. They're servant people. They care about God. They care about the world. They care about making a difference, finding meaning, expressing mission. All those things are there. They are needing, at least 50 to 60% of the time, they're needing to be equipped and encouraged. Mm-hmm. They just need something that helps them not just get through the week, but make sure that when they're going to serve at the soup kitchen or at the homeless shelter or to teach school or to manage that office again or to deal with those folks as a school teacher, they're needing to know that what they're doing is making a difference.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And I never did have that thought in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that it wasn't there and it wasn't needed, but I was taught to come up with 3 points in a poem and some kind of story and make sure there was a thread that ran through it and connect it and to build from one Sunday to the next in pastoral preaching and do something different on Sunday nights and Wednesday nights. It would augment and interweave. And that's how I was taught. And now I feel as if I am truly appreciated more for being a preacher instead of being a pastor.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean that I'm not appreciated as a pastor, but I think they are wanting a message that says what you're doing is so important that we would live in a very different world if you were not doing it. I feel like I'm now preaching to a minority group living in a harsh world, wanting to encourage them and equip them.
That's a great observation. I had a young pastor tell me, one of my former students, I said, how has all of this pandemic affected your preaching? And he said, I was taught to be a prophet and I was taught to be a pastor. He said, now I know that it's being a pastor that people need, because when they can barely get up and move on, and when there's so much uncertainty in the world and so many things that, are problematic to many of us, we do need a word of hope and encouragement. Yeah. And I know what a great preacher you are, Dennis, and I know you provide that.
Well, that's not true, but I appreciate it. The challenge that I find too with our young adults, we had during the pandemic, we've had 15 babies born in this church. And the young adults are stressed out with childcare and the fact that their preschoolers cannot be vaccinated, but they're missing community. So they'll sometimes come and bring them, and I'll see them sitting off in the balcony or off to the side with 3 or 4 of them together, sharing space, with their infants to have some safe space. And I just want to affirm each of you all, because as I look at this is kind of like Hollywood squares from my earlier life. But as I look at you all, I just want to say a word of gratitude to you. When I wrote down the names here at the top of my sheet of the people that were in this session, each one of you have left fingerprints on my life and ministry, and either directly or indirectly. And I appreciate that and value that. But I want to say to you, don't stop. Just your voices still matter. Your encouragement of others coming along behind you matters. So keep doing that, please. It still makes a difference.
Dennis, thank you for that wonderful word of affirmation. I don't want to keep you beyond your dinner time or, spending a little bit of time with your spouse and family. I want to say how much I've enjoyed being with you today. And I'm very, very grateful to be a part of this group. Andy, I see you back from the dentist. I hope you have all your teeth in. You didn't. Okay. Good to see all of you. And I hope you have a blessed and wonderful day.
Thank you. You've done a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Good to see you, Rob Johnson. So,
Thanks for letting me sit in.
Hey, Melinda.
I enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. So good to see both of you again, at least not in person, but you know, over the Zoom.
I just wish you had the answers. You didn't say anything that we haven't said before, but we don't know what to do now. They're starting this new thing at church, but you know, I don't know what they're going to do, and I don't think they know either.
Well, I wish I had the answers, Melinda. I would write a book and finally write a book that would make some money for me if I had the answers to that. But
I'd buy it if you had the answers.
Yeah, I'll try to work on the answers and write the book. Okay.
Well, but there's value in knowing what the questions are.
Yeah.
There's a lot of value in knowing the questions where we need to be moving. But thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Andy. Thank you. And Melinda, thank you for your help. Okay. And you all
Diana,
take
hello for us.
Diana.
I will.
Diana.
I sure will.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Enjoyed it, Chuck. This is
Thank
Bob.
you.
Enjoyed
Hey,
it.
Bob.